I remember the heat of that summer, a thick, suffocating blanket of humidity that turned the air into wet wool. My grandfather's farm was a skeleton of a place, decaying timber and rusted iron, miles away from the nearest neighbor in the dark heart of West Virginia. There was no running water, not since the pipes burst back in '94 and the old man decided he was too tired to fix them. "Don't go near the stone well in the north pasture," he told me, his voice a dry rattle in his throat. "The water's gone sour. It's got the copper rot." I was 17. I thought sour water just meant bacteria or old moss. I didn't understand that some things survive in the dark because the sun is their only enemy. The well was an old construct, heavy gray stones, moss-covered and slick, sitting under the shade of a dying willow tree. It felt cold there, even when the thermometer hit 100 degrees. A pocket of unnatural winter. I first noticed something was wrong when I was leaning against the stone rim, throwing pebbles into the blackness just to hear them hit the bottom. The first stone fell. The second stone fell, but the third pebble didn't make a sound. I waited. I leaned over the edge, the smell of wet earth and something metallic rising from the depths. It wasn't copper. It was the smell of a butcher's shop at the end of a long day. Then, I heard a movement. It wasn't a splash. It wasn't a thud. It was a wet, heavy contact, like a piece of raw meat being dropped onto a stone floor. I froze. My shadow was cast deep into the well by the midday sun. But as I watched, the shadow at the bottom moved. It didn't shift with the sun. It uncoiled. It was a pale, translucent shape. It looked like a human limb, but too long, with too many joints. It moved with a jittery, mechanical precision. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs. Just an animal, I whispered to myself. A stray dog, or a sick coyote that fell in. But animals make noise. Animals breathe. The thing in the well was silent. That night, a vibration started. Not the spiritual hum of ghosts, but a physical, rhythmic drone, like the wings of a massive insect. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. I crawled out of bed, my feet cold on the bare wood. I walked to the window. The north pasture was bathed in moonlight, the old willow tree looking like a skeletal hand reaching for the stars. The well was open. I knew I had closed the heavy wooden lid. I remembered sliding the iron bolt, but the lid was lying in the grass, snapped in half like a dry cracker. I saw it then. It was crouching on the rim of the well. It was naked, but its skin wasn't skin. It was a pale, waxy membrane, so thin I could see the dark, sluggish pulse of its internal organs. It had no hair, no ears, just a slit where the nose should be, and eyes that were nothing but massive, milky cataracts. It wasn't a monster from a story. It was a failure of biology. It was a creature that had been adapted to the dark, to the damp, to the pressure of the deep earth. Its limbs were elongated, the fingers tipped with thick, yellowed claws designed for digging through shale. It turned its head toward the house. It didn't have a neck. Its skull was fused directly to its shoulders, giving it a hunched, predatory silhouette. It let out a sound. It wasn't a growl. It was a sharp, ultrasonic click. It was echolocation. It was seeing the house. It was seeing me behind the glass. I ducked below the windowsill, my breath coming in jagged, terrified gasps. I heard the sound of wet footsteps on the porch. A heavy step. A second step. A long, dragging sound. It was heavy. I could hear the timber of the porch groaning under its weight. It wasn't a ghost. It was 200 pounds of muscle and bone. And it was hungry. The scratching started on the front door. Slow. Rhythmic. It wasn't trying to break in. It was testing the wood, finding the weak points. "Grandpa," I screamed. I ran to his room, slamming the door behind me. But the room was empty. The bed was made, the sheets cold. The back door was wide open. My grandfather hadn't warned me about the well to protect me. He had warned me because he was the one feeding it. I found the cellar door in the kitchen was unbolted. The smell hit me first, a wave of rot, and ammonia so strong I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. I grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the stove, the only weapon I could find, and stepped into the dark. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want it to see me. Wood didn't need light. As I reached the bottom step, I heard that clicking sound again. Closer now. It was coming from behind the preserve jars. I clicked on my small pen light for a fraction of a second. I saw my grandfather. He was tied to a wooden pillar with baling wire. His mouth was taped shut, his eyes wide with a level of terror that shouldn't be possible for a human to survive. But he wasn't the only thing there. The creature was crouched over a pile of debris in the corner. It wasn't eating him. Not yet. It was sorting. There were bones. Hundreds of them. Small skeletons of foxes, deer, and things that looked disturbingly like human infants. The creature was stacking them, meticulously, by size and shape. It was building something. A nest? No, it was too precise. It was a larder. The creature turned toward me, the milky eyes reflecting the tiny beam of my light. It didn't attack. It just stood up. It was 7 feet tall. Its spine curved like a question mark. It made a new sound, a low, guttural vibration, a sound that resembled a human trying to speak through a throat full of sand. More! My blood turned to ice. It wasn't a spirit. It was a man, or what was left of one, a degenerate line of outcasts who had lived in the cave systems beneath the well for generations, inbreeding, mutating, losing their humanity to the dark. It reached for me with a hand that had 6 fingers. I didn't wait. I swung the skillet with every ounce of strength I had. The iron hit its skull with a dull, sickening thud. The creature didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It just tilted its head and clicked. The impact of the iron skillet should have cracked its skull, but it was like hitting a sack of wet sand. The creature's head merely rolled with the blow, its neck twisting at an angle that made my own stomach turn. It didn't bleed. A thick, translucent fluid leaked from the corner of its mouth, smelling of bile and old copper. I backed away, my boots slipping on the damp concrete of the cellar floor. My pen light flickered, the beam dancing over the creature's face. It wasn't just pale, it was alive with movement. Beneath that waxy, translucent skin, I could see parasites, small, white worms coiled in its muscle tissue. It wasn't a man anymore. It was a colony. The creature took a step toward me. A heavy, wet step. A second step. It reached out with its elongated arm, the 6 fingers splaying wide. Its touch was cold, a freezing, damp pressure that felt like being touched by a corpse. It gripped my shoulder, and the strength in those thin, spindly fingers was unreal. I felt my collarbone groan under the pressure. I screamed, swinging the light at its eyes. The creature let out a sharp, ultrasonic click and recoiled, not because of the pain, but because of the light. Its milky eyes were designed for the absolute darkness of a deep earth. To this thing, my tiny penlight was a supernova. I used the moment to scramble toward my grandfather. The baling wire was dug deep into his wrists, the skin purple and swollen. I didn't have a knife. I clawed at the wire, my fingernails breaking, my breath coming in panicked, shallow sobs. "Grandpa, I'm going to get you out. I'm going to." He shook his head frantically. His eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking behind me. I turned. The creature was no longer standing. It had dropped to all fours, its spine arching like a cat's. It began to circle us, moving with a terrifying, fluid speed. It didn't walk. It flowed over the wooden crates and preserved jars, its claws clicking against the glass. It was hurting us. It wasn't trying to kill me yet. It was checking for weaknesses. It was waiting for me to tire. I realized then why the well was so important. The stone structure wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a chimney, It was the only air source for a massive subterranean network of caves that stretched for miles beneath the Appalachian crust. These things, this family of shadows, they have been down there for 100 years, living on blind fish, cave crickets, and whatever my grandfather had been tossing down that hole to keep them from coming up. The deal was broken. The creature stopped in the corner, beneath the stairs. It stood up again, its head brushing against the low ceiling. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of small, needle-like teeth. Hungry, the word was distorted. Wet, but it was clear. It reached up and gripped the bottom step of the cellar stairs. With a casual, effortless pull, it ripped the timber clean off the frame. We were trapped. The creature began to drag the heavy, broken preserved jars toward the center of the room. It was working with a methodical, obsessive focus. It ignored me for a moment, its long fingers picking through the glass and the spilled peaches, looking for something specific. I saw what it was holding. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and dented, but unmistakable. It was my grandmother's. She had gone missing 10 years ago. The police said she had wandered off into the woods, that the dementia had taken her. My grandfather let out a muffled, heartbroken moan behind the tape. The creature held the locket to its slit of the nose, inhaling deeply. It let out a low, vibrating purr. It didn't value the silver. It valued the lingering scent. It looked at my grandfather, then at me. It began to mimic a sound, a soft, feminine hum, a lullaby my grandmother used to sing to me when I was a child. The sound was wrong. It was played at the wrong speed, with a mechanical, stuttering quality, but the melody was there. It was using its vocal cords like a tape recorder, playing back the last sounds it had heard from its previous harvest. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This thing wasn't just a scavenger. It was a record of death. I looked around the cellar, desperately searching for an exit. There was a small coal chute high up in the wall, barely wider than my shoulders. It was blocked by a rusted iron grate. I had to reach it. I grabbed a heavy wooden crate and pushed it toward the wall. The sound of the wood scraping across the concrete was like a dinner bell. The creature stopped humming. It turned its head, the milky eyes fixing on my position. It didn't click this time. It let out a deep, guttural hiss. It lunged. I dived to the side as the creature's weight slammed into the crate, smashing the thick oak into splinters. It was faster than I could have imagined. It moved like a blur of pale, waxy flesh. I scrambled toward the coal chute, jumping onto a stack of old tires. My fingers gripped the iron grate. It was cold, slimy with mildew. The creature was already on the tires. I felt its claws sink into the leather of my boot. It tugged. I kicked back, my heel connecting with its face. I felt the soft, squelching resistance of its nose. The creature let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek and fell back. I pulled at the grate. The rusted bolts groaned. Come on, come on. I pulled with every ounce of survival instinct I had left. The iron gave way with a sharp, metallic snap. I looked down. The creature was standing at the base of the tires, looking up. It wasn't angry anymore. It looked curious. It opened its mouth, and I saw its throat. It was pulsing, expanding, like the chest of a bullfrog. It wasn't going to climb. It was going to project. A thick, black, viscous liquid sprayed from its mouth. It wasn't bile. It was a gastric acid, a digestive enzyme meant to soften the meat of its prey before consumption. The liquid hit the wall next to my head, the stone beginning to hiss and smoke instantly. I scrambled into the chute, the narrow, dark tunnel smelling of soot and old rain. I didn't look back. I crawled upward, my skin scraping against the rough stone, the sound of the creature's clicks echoing up the tunnel behind me. I burst out into the night air, falling onto the damp grass behind the house. I was out, but I could hear the sound of the back door being ripped off its hinges. It was coming out too, and it knew my scent. I didn't run for the road. The road was 2 miles away, and the creature was faster than any human. I ran for the one place it wouldn't expect, the well. I knew the anatomy of the farm. I knew the north pasture was open, but the well was surrounded by the thick, drooping branches of the dying willow. If it used echolocation, the willow branches would act as a silencer. The thousands of thin, hanging leaves would create a chaotic, distorted signal. I ran through the tall grass, the moon disappearing behind a thick bank of clouds. I could hear it behind me, a heavy, wet gallop, a long, dragging slide. It was playing with me. It could have caught me in seconds, but it was enjoying the hunt. It was a predator that hadn't had a fast kill in years. I reached the willow tree, ducking under the curtain of branches. The air was colder here. The smell of copper was overwhelming. I reached the rim of the well. The broken lid was still lying in the grass. I looked down into blackness. The well wasn't just a hole. It was a vertical tunnel. I grabbed a long, heavy piece of the broken lid. I stood by the stone rim. My breath held, my heart a frantic, drumming weight in my ears. The creature burst through the willow branches. It stopped. It began to click, its head tilting from side to side. The willow worked. The creature looked confused. The ultrasonic waves were bouncing off the leaves, creating 1,000 ghost images of me in its mind. It crept forward, its claws digging into the soft earth. It was 5 feet away. 4 feet. It reached the edge of the tree's shadow. The moon broke through the clouds, the silver light hitting the creature's pale, waxy skin. It looked pathetic under the direct light. It looked like a giant, hairless fetus. It was a victim of its own environment, a byproduct of a century of isolation and darkness. It sensed me. Its head snapped toward the well. It didn't see me. It saw the vacuum where I was standing. It lunged. I swung the heavy piece of the wooden lid like a baseball bat. I didn't hit the creature. I hit the stone rim. The wood shattered, sending a shower of splinters into the creature's face. It recoiled, its balance shifting. I stepped forward and shoved. I put every pound of my weight into its chest. The waxy skin felt like wet rubber. The creature didn't scream. It just tumbled. I watched as it fell into the blackness of the well. I waited for the sound of it hitting the bottom. I waited and waited. There was no sound. The well was deeper than I thought. It didn't have a bottom. It had a network. I stood at the edge, gasping for air. Then, from the depths, a sound rose. It wasn't a click. It wasn't a hiss. It was a multitude of voices, hundreds of them, all humming the same feminine lullaby. The creature wasn't alone. The well was a hive, and I had just rung the dinner bell. The sound rising from the well wasn't a choir. It was a vibration that traveled through the soles of my boots and in my very marrow. Hundreds of voices, all mimicking the same distorted, stuttering lullaby my grandmother used to sing. It was the sound of 1,000 broken records playing at once, a sonic wall of grief and hunger. I backed away from the stone rim, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped my penlight into the abyss. The willow tree began to rustle, not from the wind, but from the ground. The roots were shifting. The earth around the well began to buckle and crack, as if something massive was pushing upward from the subterranean dark. I saw the first one emerge. It wasn't the creature I had pushed. This one was smaller, leaner, its skin so translucent I could see the black, knotted cluster of its heart pulsing behind its ribs. It didn't use the rim. It clawed its way through the dirt, its fingers elongated and hooked, pulling its pale, waxy body out of the soil like a maggot from a wound. Then another, and another. They were pouring out of the earth, not just from the well, but from the entire root system of the willow. The tree had been their anchor, their secret doorway to the surface. I turned and bolted toward the farmhouse. The grass felt like it was alive, the blades whipping against my shins. I could hear the clicking behind me, a rapid fire, ultrasonic chatter that sounded like a forest of dead wood snapping in a storm. They were communicating. They were coordinates. They were flanking me. I reached the porch, my lungs burning, my vision blurring with exhaustion. I dived through the open back door and slammed it shut, sliding the heavy iron bolt just as a weight hit the wood from the outside. A dull, wet thud, then a scratch. I leaned my back against the door, sliding down until I hit the floor. I was sobbing, my chest heaving in the dark. "Grandpa," I whispered. The house was silent. The kitchen smelled of the acid the creature had sprayed in the cellar. The smell was spreading, eating away at the floorboards, a sour, chemical rot that made my eyes water. I realized I couldn't stay in the kitchen. The cellar door was still open, and the stairs were gone. They were coming up through the floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the stairs to the second floor. I needed height. I needed a vantage point. I reached the top landing and ducked into the bathroom, locking the door. I sat on the edge of the old clawfoot tub, clutching the iron skillet like a holy relic. Then, I heard it, the sound of my grandfather's voice. "Help me, son." It was coming from the hallway, just outside the bathroom door. It sounded perfect. The same raspy, tobacco-stained tone. The same tired, West Virginian drawl. "Open the door. They're gone." I reached for the handle. My fingers were an inch away from the cold metal when I stopped. Grandfather was tied up in the cellar. I had seen him. He had tape over his mouth. He couldn't have escaped. Not without the stairs. Not with those things down there. I stepped back. "Grandpa," I asked, my voice trembling. "What's my middle name?" Silence. The humming started again. A low, vibrating purr that made the porcelain of the sink rattle. "Open the door." The voice repeated, but this time the pitch shifted. The words began to stretch, the vowels turning into a high-pitched, electronic whine. "O-O-P-E-N-D-O-R." The door handle began to turn. Slowly, methodically. The lock held for a second. Then the wood around the frame began to hiss. The acid. They were using their gastric juices to melt the hardware. I looked at the bathroom window. It was small, a frosted glass pane that led out onto the porch roof. I didn't have a choice. I smashed the glass with the skillet. The sound was like a gunshot in the cramped space. I scrambled through the frame, the shards of glass cutting into my palms, and rolled onto the shingles of the roof. The night air was cold, but the house was alive. I looked down. The porch was covered in them. At least a dozen of the pale, waxy shapes were clinging to the siding, their long, spindly limbs allowing them to walk vertically like gargoyles. They were watching the window. They were waiting for me to jump. I crawled along the peak of the roof, my fingers digging into the rough shingles. I needed to get to the barn. The old tractor was in there, and the keys were always in the ignition. If I could reach it, I could plow through the gate and get to the main road. But the barn was 50 yards away. 50 yards of open, moonlit grass. I looked back at the bathroom window. One of the creatures was pulling itself through the frame. It moved with a jittery, broken neck rhythm, its milky eyes scanning the roof. It didn't see me yet. I was pressed against the brick of the chimney, trying to become part of the shadow. The creature reached the peak. It stood up, its 7-foot frame silhouetted against the pale moon. It raised its head and let out a long, piercing click. Her response came from the woods, then from the barn, then from the well. They weren't just a family. They were a colony, and this farm was their breeding ground. My grandfather hadn't just been feeding them. He had been protecting them. He was the caretaker of a nightmare that predated the town itself. The creature on the roof began to move toward me. It didn't walk. It skittered, its limbs splaying out at impossible angles. I looked at the chimney. The mortar was old, crumbling. I grabbed a loose brick and hurled it at the creature's chest. It hit the waxy skin and bounced off, falling into the yard below. The creature stopped. It tilted its head, and then it began to mimic the sound of the brick hitting the ground. A hollow, rhythmic thud. 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 It was mocking me. Or perhaps it was learning the physics of the surface world. I didn't wait for it to reach me. I slid down the roof toward the gutter, my feet dangling over the edge. I looked down at the porch. The creatures below were looking up, their mouths open, their throats pulsing with that black, acidic bile. I saw a gap, a small, dark space between the porch and the old oak tree. I jumped. The wind caught my breath, and for a second, I was weightless. I hit a thick branch, the wood snapping under my weight, and tumbled through the leaves until I hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact. I didn't stop to check for broken bones. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the barn. Behind me, the house was a hive of activity. The pale shapes were pouring out of the windows, jumping from the roof, their wet footsteps hitting the grass in a frantic, overlapping beat. I reached the barn doors and slid them open just enough to squeeze through. The smell of hay and oil was a relief. I fumbled for the tractor, my hands sweeping over the cold, rusted metal. I found the seat. I found the key. I turned it. The engine groaned. A slow, mechanical protest. It turned over, but it didn't start. The clicking was outside the door. Hundreds of them. They were surrounding the barn. Please, I whispered, my forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Please start. I turned the key again. The engine roared to life, the vibration shaking the very foundations of the barn. The headlights cut through the dark, revealing the interior of the barn. And that's when I saw the truth. The barn wasn't for hay. It was filled with cages, dozens of them, and they weren't empty. The cages were made of heavy, reinforced steel. Inside, there were people, or what used to be people. They were in various stages of the transformation. Some still had hair, still had human eyes, still wore the tattered remains of flannel shirts and denim jeans. Others were already pale, their limbs beginning to stretch, their eyes clouding over with that milky film. They weren't being eaten. They were being processed. My grandfather wasn't just a farmer. He was a breeder. He was taking this sour water from the well, which I now realized was a mutagenic, chemical-laden runoff from the deep earth, and he was feeding it to them. The missing people from the town, the travelers who disappeared on the highway, they were all here. One of the men in the cages looked at me. He pressed his face against the bars, his mouth moving soundlessly. He didn't have teeth anymore, just those sharp, obsidian needles. Help, he hissed. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. The creatures outside the barn began to tear at the wooden siding. I could hear the boards snapping, the claws digging into the timber. They wanted their kin. They wanted a new stock. I slammed the tractor into gear. The massive rear tires gripped the dirt, throwing up a cloud of dust and hay. I drove straight for the main barn doors. The wood exploded into splinters. I burst out into the night, the tractor's headlights illuminating a sea of pale, waxy flesh. There were dozens of them, hundreds, a carpet of shadows. I didn't stop. I drove through them. I felt the sickening, soft resistance as the tires rolled over their bodies. They didn't scream. They just made that wet, popping sound like overripe fruit. The gate was ahead, the road to freedom, but a weight hit the back of the tractor. The 7-foot creature from the roof had jumped from the barn loft. It was clinging to the exhaust pipe, its long fingers wrapping around the metal, its milky eyes inches from my face. It didn't attack. It leaned in and whispered in my grandfather's voice, "You have the blood too." It pointed at my arm. I looked down. In the light of the dashboard, I saw my skin. It wasn't tan from the summer sun anymore. It was turning translucent. I could see the black, knotted veins pulsing beneath my wrist. The copper taste in my mouth wasn't from the water. It was from the change. The tractor roared, the engine straining as the creature's weight shifted the balance of the machine. I swung the iron skillet one last time, connecting with the creature's hand. The fingers didn't break. They dissolved. The creature let out a hiss and fell back into the dirt. But I could see its face as it vanished into the dark. It wasn't angry. It was smiling. I hit the gate at 40 miles an hour. The metal snapped, and I was on the road. I drove until the gas ran out. I drove until the sun began to peek over the Appalachian ridges, staining the sky a bloody, bruised purple. I left the tractor in a ditch and started walking. I reached the town of Silver Creek by noon. I walked into the local diner, my clothes torn, my skin pale, my eyes burning in the light of the neon signs. The waitress looked at me. She dropped her coffee pot. "Honey, what happened to you?" I didn't answer. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. My eyes weren't brown anymore. They were turning a flat, milky white. I reached up and touched my jaw. I felt a bump, a new joint. I realized then that my grandfather hadn't been protecting the creatures. He had been protecting the world from US. The copper rot wasn't a disease. It was a dormant gene, a remnant of an older, darker branch of the human tree. And all it took was one sip of the water from that well to wake it up. I walked back out into the diner. The people were staring. I could hear their heartbeats. I could hear the rhythmic, mechanical drone of the electricity in the walls. It was too loud. I opened my mouth to speak, to warn them, to tell them to burn the farm. But the only thing that came out was a click. The people in the diner backed away, their faces masks of confusion and fear. But I didn't see their fear. I saw their vitality. I saw the heat radiating from their necks, the pulsing, rhythmic flow of the blood in their carotid arteries. It looked like a map of where to bite. I turned and ran out of the diner, into the blinding, painful glare of the afternoon sun. Every ray of light felt like a needle being driven into my retinas. I found a dark alleyway behind a hardware store and collapsed behind a dumpster. I was changing, fast. My bones were softening, stretching, snapping into new configurations. My skin felt tight, itchy, like a suit that was 3 sizes too small. I reached up and gripped my own face. I could feel the nose bridge collapsing, the ears shrinking. I was becoming a scavenger. And then, I felt it, the connection. It wasn't a voice. It was a shared perspective. I could see the farm. I could see my grandfather, now untied, standing by the well. He wasn't crying. He was looking at the horizon, toward the town. "Go, my children," he whispered. I wasn't in the alleyway anymore. I was everywhere. I could feel the creatures moving through the sewers beneath Silver Creek. I could feel them huddled in the basements of the houses, waiting for the sun to go down. We were a colony, and the town of Silver Creek was the new larder. I looked at my hands one last time. The 6-finger hand was now fully formed, the claws sharp and yellowed. I didn't feel like a monster. I felt efficient. I felt purposeful. The sun finally dipped below the horizon. The shadows stretched out, long and inviting. I stood up. I didn't use my legs like a human. I dropped to all fours, my spine arching, my head tilting to the side. I let out a single, ultrasonic click. 1,000 responses came back from the dark, from the sewers, from the basements, from the well. The harvest had begun. The town didn't go out with a scream. It went out with a click. By midnight, the lights in Silver Creek were all dark. The power lines had been chewed through. The transformers hissed and died. The only light came from the moon, reflecting off the pale, waxy skin of the hundreds of shapes moving through the streets. We moved in a single, synchronized wave. We didn't kill everyone. Not yet. We needed the stock. We dragged them from their beds, their mouths taped with their own bed sheets. We carried them back toward the farm, back toward the well, back toward the darkness where they belonged. I was the leader of the pack. I was the bridge between the old world and the new. I reached the hardware store where I had hidden. I saw the owner, a man who had sold me candy when I was a kid. He was hiding behind the counter, clutching a shotgun. He pointed at me. "Stay back, you freak." I didn't stay back. I moved with a fluid, mechanical grace that his human eyes couldn't follow. I was on him in a heartbeat. I didn't bite. I didn't claw. I leaned in, and whisper in my grandmother's voice, "It's time for bed, dear." I watched his eyes go wide. I watched the recognition hit him. Then, I clicked. The sound shattered his eardrums. He dropped the gun, clutching his head. I picked him up, his weight nothing to my new elongated limbs. I carried him out into the night. The procession was miles long, a line of pale, waxy figures, each carrying a human burden. We reached the farm by dawn. The well was waiting. My grandfather was standing there, the silver lock in his hand. He looked at me, and for a second, I saw a tear in his eye. "The water is sour, isn't it, son?" I didn't answer. I dropped the hardware store owner into the hole. I watched him disappear into the blackness. Then, I looked at my grandfather. He was the last one, the last anchor to the world above. I walked toward him. He didn't run. He just opened his arms. "I'm tired, son. Take me home." I picked him up. He was light, like a bird made of dry sticks. I stood at the edge of the stone rim. I looked out at the world one last time. The sun was coming up, but it didn't matter. The world below was bigger. The dark was deeper, and we were the masters of the deep. I jumped. We didn't fall. We returned.